This session is about Trump, Putin, and the future of the second nuclear age. And to address that, we've got three very experienced former ministers from three key countries, one of which is in fact a nuclear weapon state, and the other two are umbrella states in the sense that they rely on extended nuclear deterrence. But what we are going to do is I'll ask them to make short 5-minute introductory statements and then address some specific questions to them. And I'd like to leave at least half an hour for Q&A from the audience towards the end. But I'd like to begin myself. This is a choice of microphones now. I'd like to begin myself by just explaining what I meant, or what we mean by the second nuclear age. With the first nuclear age, effectively we had an overarching ideological rivalry of the bipolar Cold War rivals. There were competitive nuclear arms buildups between the two superpowers. They developed between them quite a sophisticated range of mechanisms for ensuring strategic stability through what I would call the politics of antagonistic collaboration, based on the recognition that their common interest in sustaining nuclear peace overrode points of friction and rivalry and competition. And this included regular, structured, strategic nuclear policy dialogues, firstly among the allies themselves, and secondly between the allies on the one side and the Soviet bloc on the other. The center of that was the European theater. By contrast, in the second nuclear age, the site of great power rivalry has migrated to the Asia Pacific from Europe, although we've seen an upsurge in these tensions in Europe in the past 2-3 years as well. Instead of just two overriding nuclear rivals with some other qualifications, we've got today a multitude of nuclear armed states with crisscrossing ties of cooperation and conflict. We've got something today that we didn't have through the Cold War, and that is simultaneous, long-running, and major territorial disputes between not just dyads, but in one case at least, triangular nuclear relationship, India-Pakistan, India-China, and some overlap of territorial disputes where all three countries come in. We've got fragility of command and control systems. We've got cyber threats and great interest in cybersecurity, including we've had a panel at this forum this year. We've got blurring of the boundary between conventional precision global strike munitions and nuclear weapons, with the resulting blurring of even the normative boundary between using conventional weapons and nuclear weapons use. We've got an increasing convergence of nuclear, cyber, and space domains in a way that certainly did not exist in the first nuclear age. We've got, and we've dealt with this in other sessions at the forum, asymmetric perceptions between the military and political utility of nuclear weapons. And it seems to me the fact that the two countries that stress the political utility of nuclear weapons over its military usefulness are the two countries that have no first use policy, China and India. And I don't think that is just coincidental. We've got more complex deterrence relationships among several of the 9 nuclear weapon possessing countries today, with the result that changes in the nuclear posture of one can have a cascading effect in shaping the nuclear postures, policies, and even deployments of some of the others. For example, you cannot come to any understanding of the bilateral nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan without also bringing in China and its nuclear policies. And this is true. The triangular linkage extends historically, conceptually, strategically, and also operationally. We have state-sponsored cross-border militancy and extremism among some of the nuclear armed states, which was not true in the first nuclear age. We've got risk of nuclear terrorism today, with some groups wanting to get their hands on these weapons if they can. Again, that is something distinctive to our use. So really, if you put all these different propositions together, the basic point of difference of the second nuclear age compared to the first is that the central dynamics and drivers of nuclear policy and nuclear relations today are qualitatively different from the first nuclear age. And added to that is the fact that although we have far fewer numbers of nuclear warheads globally, down from something like 70,000 in the mid-1980s to 15,000 today, the reality is that there is a more likely use of nuclear weapons today than there was in the first nuclear age, if not by design, then by accident, rogue launch, or system error. And it is in that context that we have two countries which still between them possess something like 93% of global nuclear stockpiles, and that's the United States and Russia. And we have the leaders of these two countries that could not have more contrasting personalities and leadership qualities. And that is what is the central theme of this panel. Because with that volume of nuclear stockpiles, the fate of the world is in their hands, and it's the quality of decision making that will determine, therefore, the destiny of the world. With that, I'd like to begin. What I would suggest is that we begin with a short, as I said, 5-minute introductory remarks from Gareth. Then we'll move to Minister Kim, and we'll come back to Des Brown. Gareth.
I'll have to have the mic, I think. Thanks very much. Thanks, colleagues, and thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you. The world is really now closer to a catastrophic nuclear weapon exchange than has been the case since at any time since the height of the Cold War, the first nuclear age. That's not a particularly alarmist view. It's now almost a mainstream view. It's the view adopted by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. When you remember earlier this year, they moved the hands of their doomsday clock to 2.5 minutes to midnight, which is the closest they've been since the mid-1950s. It's the view of those very hard-headed Cold War nuclear realists, previous staunch defenders of nuclear weapons, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Bill Perry, and certainly my own view. That concern has 4 main components. Let me briefly spell them out. The first is that so long as there continues to be the number of nuclear weapons there are out there, some 15,400, so long as so many of them continue to be operationally deployed, some 7,000 of those, and so long as so many continue to be on effectively hair-trigger alert, some 2,000 of those, then there is a huge risk of a nuclear exchange being initiated, even in the absence of a deliberate decision by governments to do so. There's a huge risk of it being initiated by human or system error, by accident, or by miscalculation. We know now just how many times during the supposedly constrained and well-ordered period of the Cold War years between Soviet Union and the United States, just how close, how often we came to catastrophe. It's sheer dumb luck that we've survived the last 7.5 decades. Without such a catastrophe, we can't assume that luck will continue. Point 1. Point 2, the problem of that kind of catastrophe is compounded now by the fact that we have more nuclear-armed states than ever before. As bad as the risks were during the Cold War years, when there were really, for most of the time, just two opposing major nuclear powers, those risks have become dramatically compounded since, as Ramesh has described, the proliferation developments that produced India, Pakistan and Israel as new nuclear-armed states, and now, most recently, North Korea, whether we'd like to acknowledge that formally or not. And in each case, in areas of great regional volatility, a history of violent conflict, and, let's acknowledge it, less sophisticated command and control systems than was the case between the United States and the Soviet Union. The third reason for my concern, that of many others, is at the very time that the world should be redoubling its efforts to move toward complete nuclear disarmament and a much stronger non-proliferation regime, we're in fact moving in the opposite direction. Despite little bits of good news here and there, the efforts of global civil society in over 120 states to initiate the negotiations we're now seeing in New York on a nuclear weapons ban, despite little skerricks of other ground for optimism here and there, the reality is that there is just no will at all on the part of any of the nuclear-armed states to move towards disarmament. The salience of nuclear weapons in national security policy is growing. Talk about the usability of nuclear weapons is growing. The United States and Russia are dramatically modernizing their arsenals, and everywhere else in Asia, nuclear weapons numbers are increasing, not diminishing. The fourth reason for my concern is, and this is, I think, the main reason why the pro-disarmament atmosphere has changed so dramatically since the heady days of President Obama's speech in Prague in 2009, the world simply has not had the leadership on this issue that is critically necessary. The problem beginning with Russia's President Putin and now being dramatically compounded by the election in the United States of Donald Trump. In the case of Putin, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, he announced his readiness, you remember, to put Russian nuclear forces on alert. Since then, he's regularly talked up the usability of nuclear weapons in language we really haven't heard since the Cold War years. And I think Des Brown will probably want to say a bit more about this. He walked away from long-standing cooperative nuclear threat reduction arrangements. He boycotted the 2016 Nuclear Security Summit, has ruled out any arms control concessions on tactical nuclear weapons, and Russia for several years now has been seen to be not complying with the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. And now we have, I don't think they're very distinct personalities, I think we have another authoritarian, or an instinctive authoritarian, on the other side of the equation of those two countries which between them do possess nearly 95% of the world's stockpile. About the only nuclear arms limitation agreement to which Putin seemed to be still committed is the New START Treaty, which was negotiated with Obama and which has resulted in significant numbers, at least in deployed strategic weapons. But when Putin proposed to the incoming President Trump that this treaty be extended to 2021, I'm afraid he met his match, because Trump, after discovering from asking his aides what on earth it was, reportedly rebuffed him, saying that its extension was a very bad idea because it was a bad deal. Now, this was consistent with Trump's tweet in December saying, which has been quoted forever since, that the United States must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability, which he followed with a response to MSNBC when they sought clarification as to what that meant, when Trump said, "Let it be an arms race. We will outmatch them and outlast them all." So this and multiple other similarly extraordinary statements from Trump have certainly led me, for one, to describe him in a speech in Australia recently to the National Press Club as manifestly the most ill-informed, underprepared, ethically challenged, and psychologically ill-equipped person ever to assume the American presidency. If we had occasion before, to be worried about miscalculation, misjudgment, human error, human idiocy in the handling of nuclear weapons, these fears are now ever more real. Just one final word. You may be surprised that I haven't mentioned among my primary concerns 3 other issues which have generated an enormous amount of angst around the world, not least in this part of the world. One of them is the possibility of nuclear terrorism, the possibility that armed groups, terrorist groups, might get hold of a full-scale nuclear weapon, detonate it with catastrophic results. I don't think that's a particularly real concern for reasons I'm happy to spell out later if the opportunity arises. There's equally been a lot of attention paid to the possibility of the Iran nuclear deal going bad and Iran rushing in that context to establish its own nuclear weapons armory with flow-on proliferation impact around the region. I don't think either that is a particularly real ground for concern at the moment for reasons, again, I'm happy to spell out later, haven't got time to do so now. Nor have I mentioned, perhaps more surprisingly in this context, the North Korea situation. And again, good reasons for that, which I'm happy to spell out. I won't stop now. But in short, because I, for one, am persuaded that while there's a lot of oddities about North Korean behaviour, they know perfectly well that to do anything remotely homicidal with any weapons, let alone nuclear weapons, to anything homicidal would be totally suicidal, so far as the regime is concerned. I'm reinforced in that perspective by the view that I saw in a foreign policy article headline a couple of weeks ago, in which I've heard repeated actually a number of times by people across the spectrum in Korea that I've talked to over the last couple of days, and that is that South Koreans, by and large, are more worried about Donald Trump than they are about North Korea. So that brings me back really to where I started. The real nuclear problem of this age is really what it always has been: the obduracy of the nuclear armed states, and in particular the 2 largest of them possessing, as we've heard, nearly 95% of the global stockpile. I'm an optimist about a great many things, and we had reason again to have our optimism reinforced by Al Gore this morning talking about climate change. But I have to say, I really have to say, that it's hard to be anything but pessimistic about the possibility anytime soon of real progress towards nuclear disarmament.
Thanks, Gareth. You can keep the mic on that side. Sung Hwan, after that very optimistic depiction of the global nuclear landscape, South Korea, of course, is one of the front lines on this whole issue. So with that in mind, again, if you could just give a short introduction to where you see things heading.
Thank you, Ramesh. Frankly, it is my honor and pleasure to be here together with Gareth and Des Brown, who are leading and initiating the international debate on non-proliferation and disarmament. As you can imagine, in Korea, when you talk about nuclear issue, it is always North Korean nuclear issue. When you talk about nuclear issue in other countries, we think some people call it kind of luxury, and it is far away thing from us, because we are always living under the constant threat of North Korean nuclear and missile programs. As you can imagine, only this year, they made new missile tests 9 times, and since the inauguration of my new president, they are welcoming our new president every week with a new missile test, and they already made nuclear test 5 times. So, for Koreans, always our priority concern is how to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. Even though we have denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, agreement between South and North Korea, but it is almost dead now, and we had agreed framework, and we had 2005, I think, September 19th agreement, and also another Leap Day deal between U.S. and North Korea, but all are not in force now. So with the inauguration of a new president, our concern on North Korean nuclear issue has been heightened. And as just Gareth mentioned, we have a strong personality of Trump, who never said about importance of security issue during his campaign. But fortunate thing is, after he assumed his presidentship, he's started to talk about importance of alliance. So it is a bit relieving, but in terms of consistency, his remarks are not that consistent. Sometimes he's saying that I can talk with Kim Jong-un. Sometimes he's heavily criticizing. So, the people's concern is whether the chemistry between my new president and Trump will go well. So, because next month we'll have a first summit, and my new president, he's a human rights lawyer, and President Trump, he's a businessman. So, there are kind of apprehension on how they will go well, and there is a discord, possibility of discord between them, particularly on how to approach North Korean nuclear issue. So we'll see how they will do. And also, because of this North Korean issue, Korea have not actively participated in the international debate on non-proliferation and disarmament. And for the same reason, we are not participating in the ban treaty negotiation as well. So, what I want to tell our colleagues is that when you talk about this non-proliferation disarmament, we should take into the security concerns of each country as well. As an umbrella country, always we had to depend on the U.S. for extended deterrence. In principle, Korea also support for elimination of all nuclear weapons, but under the current situation, it is not easy to strongly insist on. We should eliminate all nuclear weapons right now. So, when you talk about, even in international community, we should think of our security concern as well. And I hope Des Brown and also Garrett, also Ramesh, you will give the Korean audience insight and knowledge on debate on that. I'm a new member of APL, and I'm still in the listening mode and the learning process, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Song-Hwan. Des, are there any rosebuds of consolation to be gathered?
So first of all, thank you, Ramesh, and can I just say how pleased I am. In fact, I'm honored to be here and invited to join in this growing, important dialogue about peace and prosperity, the Jeju Forum. So I always enjoy coming to this part of the world, and I'm always welcomed and have been on this occasion too. So I bring, as you can tell from my accent, if you can pick up the Scottish flavour of it, I bring a European perspective to this. Increasingly, I think British people have given up going around the world telling people how they should run their affairs. So I come not to do that, but to share with you a Euro-Atlantic perspective on the challenge of how these two significant figures in this very complex environment may or will work together, addressing some of the most serious challenges the world has ever faced. So I'm conscious also that I come from a part of the world which has, I think in total, Ramesh, 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world. You know, we spend a lot of time rightly concerned about small numbers of nuclear weapons in emerging nuclear states. But all of my life, I have lived in a part of the world which has had thousands of nuclear weapons. And most importantly, and presently, 2,000 of those nuclear weapons, as Gareth said, which are minutes from use. And I really mean minutes from use, and in at least the case of the Russian weapons, the last 6 minutes of those minutes is completely automated and cannot be reversed. So, this is an extremely dangerous environment, and those of you who are conscious of what's happening in that world at the moment know that there are dangerous incidents happening on a regular basis in the air and at sea, and movements on land, which, had they been happening during the Cold War, would have been the cause of great concern to military and political leaders, and there would have been constant dialogue across those borders about these activities, because it doesn't take much for things to deteriorate and then to escalate. And we have had events, which could have been capable of doing that if they were not handled properly. For example, when Turkey shot down a Russian aircraft that crossed its territory. So I think that probably answers your question, Ramesh. I think, coming from this environment, I don't see many green shoots of anything that is likely to flower in the short term. But let me just share with you a perspective, which is a particular perspective because of my recent history. Although British, I spent the last 3 years of my life living and working in Washington, D.C. for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a well-known NGO in Washington, which works on nuclear material security issues writ large, and indeed is chaired, and the chief executive was former Senator Sam Nunn, of the 4 authors of the Wall Street Journal op-ed that Gareth referred to. So this was an extraordinary time to live and work in the United States, as you can imagine, over the last 3 years. So I took up my job there, and my arrival coincided with the last few years of a presidency that had once held enormous, tremendous promise in many areas that are important to everyone in this room. Significant advancement in global engagement and multilateralism and the power of diplomacy. President Barack Obama had come to office as an acolyte of the view that we should be reducing the salience of nuclear weapons and our strategic security, and that we should be working towards a world without nuclear weapons. And he made that famous speech in Prague, again, that is very significant to those of us who work in this area, and was the high point of the world buying into an agenda that we hoped would lead to the reduction of the importance of these weapon systems and eventually significant multilateral and complete disarmament. And indeed, he won the Nobel Prize early on for just engaging with that. And I suppose in many senses that led to the significant frustration that there was when it was not advanced as well as most people expected, because this was such a high point. But I think it's fair to say that in a number of key areas, the Obama administration, working in close partnership with other countries around the world, did deliver. It did deliver the New START Treaty, which was an important contribution. And had it been followed up by further negotiation of a New START Treaty, then we would have been celebrating even more. And from my perspective, in the work that we were doing, the administration engaged in the launching of an international partnership for nuclear disarmament verification. That may not mean much to many people outside, but to involve non-nuclear weapon states and the potential verification of disarmament is an enormous step for the world, and some significant progress was made there. And he has to be congratulated, I think, for the 4 nuclear material security summits, which made progress, although only in civilian material and not in military material. But each of these was a significant achievement, and they were made possible by the United States as a leader, playing a positive role in working together with other countries. My own country played a significant role in some of that, and many other European and Asian countries, and Latin and South American countries from all over the world, to directly address nuclear threats, and each of these will have a lasting impact. But there were disappointments and missed opportunities along the way, and we now find ourselves confronting a world that has changed rather dramatically. And amidst these unsettling changes, global momentum to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons appears to have been lost. So importantly today, and this is our principal regret, those of us who work in this space, is that despite the continuing rhetoric of the 5 nuclear weapon states and their regular statements, and there are regular statements, it seems that we are no longer pursuing this path of trying to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a rather large statement to make, but rhetoric is important, but actions are much more important. And although the 5 nuclear weapon states, when they meet regularly, make statements about still continuing on this path, a simple examination of these statements will reveal that they're invariably praying in aid things that happened 5 or 10 years ago now as being indications of making progress. I mean, these are wearing thin, these arguments. My constant request of government ministers and my government at home when they talk about multilateralism is, just give me the last 3 things that you did to advance multilateralism. Just tell me what they were. And sometimes they actually tell me that they did things that I did when I was a minister a decade ago. But this is not, I'm trying not to be partisan about this, but in these conversations which I have, I'm sometimes reduced to say, well, just give me one thing that you did. And genuinely they struggle to give you credible answers to these. Now, there are a multitude of reasons for this, and they don't need to be analysed, and it's grateful that I'm grateful to Ramesh for, what he said at the beginning, explaining this new age, and Gareth has completed that by adding all the other complexities of this. But this is a very complex world, and a much more complex world than it was when people learned how to deal with these weapons in a kind of binary situation. But this should not be a surprise to anybody, because for 20 years now, people who understood this were telling people that this was coming about. The world was changing, and that was the danger. And we're now very firmly in that environment. And then we have these 2 people that we want to talk about now in these leading roles. So we have Vladimir Putin on the one hand promising a nuclear build-up. We have Donald Trump issuing what appear to me to be reckless tweets about the wisdom of a new arms race. We have, of course, North Korea's nuclear provocations and unpredictable responses in turn from the US administration, and other debates that we've been witnessing over the last couple of days, even here, in which there is a bit of finger pointing around the place as to who's responsible for this and whose responsibility it is. And then we have as a backdrop the ramping up of the costly nuclear modernization programs in all the nuclear weapon states. And we have these sustained dangerous high alert postures and first use policies. But much more worrying to me is irresponsible rhetoric abounds. And sometimes it's not deliberately irresponsible, and I take responsibility, as a British politician, for the fact that we now have a Prime Minister who I don't think was trying to ramp up anybody's concerns about this, but feels that it's the right thing to do to say that she would use nuclear weapons when she's asked if she would do so. After almost 40 years, well, certainly since the early 1980s, of leaders of nuclear weapon states saying a nuclear war is a war that must never be fought because it can never be won. So if we have lost the reason why these phrases are important, an understanding of it, then we have a deep concern that goes beyond Presidents Putin and Trump, of world leaders, some of whom have nuclear weapons, that don't really understand the responsibility of having responsibility for these weapons.
Not much cheer there either. Let me go back to something Gareth said and quote the speech he referred to in a bit more detail. This is a direct quote from Gareth speaking on 13th April in Canberra. Donald Trump, manifestly the most ill-informed, underprepared, ethically challenged, and psychologically ill-equipped president in US history. I know, I'm quoting the full thing. Driven by instinct and impulse, unhampered by knowledge or judgment. Anyone betting on this administration delivering consistent, coherent, constructive, and decent outcomes over the next 4 years is making a very big gamble indeed, unquote. Now, Des, in the context of that statement, you've outlined a bleak last few years, but we've got Donald Trump to look forward to, if that's the right phrase, for the next 4 years, and we've got Vladimir Putin across on the other side. In that duality, how do you see European strategic nuclear affairs over the next 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, so many of my friends, in the United States of America seek to find in these difficult circumstances positive things to say. And they quite often resort to saying, well, we were very pessimistic about Ronald Reagan when he became the President of the United States. But he was, a significant disarmer in his second term. And they hope that that may be the experience of their current president, although many others, I have to say, hope there won't be a second term. But so I think we're all still in the position, of looking forward to the day when this man will behave in our perception in a presidential fashion. There is this consistent hope that the job and the importance of the job and the pressures of it and the experience of it will ameliorate his behavior. But, in anticipation of this question, which you gave me some notice of, I picked up a quote from a recent Prospect article, which also uses adjectives about the president and says, the best we can say about the emerging Trump policy on Euro-Atlantic security, which is the fundamental of this relationship, is it will be uncertain, undisciplined, and unpredictable. And I'm afraid it has proved to be that. There was an enormous sigh of relief in Europe when a president who had only disparaging things to say about the NATO alliance appeared at first to change his mind. And then we had the experience of him attending a NATO meeting in Europe, and everybody was out studying the body language, studying his behavior, studying the handshakes, studying the rhetoric, and I'm afraid he left having undone a lot of the good that had generated, and didn't at any stage bring himself to use the words that suggested that he had a sense of the responsibility the United States had as the principal ally in the alliance to the defense of the other countries. So he created a lot of, a lot of uncertainty. And then, on President Putin's side, the constant adjective that the NATO allies use about President Putin is that he is unpredictable. Russia is an unpredictable partner now. That's so I think we have to be careful about that, because in my observation, in his domestic policy and in his strategy, I think that President Putin is very predictable. He is consistent and predictable, and if anybody wants to know the view that he has of the world, then almost any speech that he has made about foreign policy, or that certainly his Foreign Minister Lavrov has made in the last 5 years, will tell you exactly the narrative that they have and their view as to why they view the challenges that Russia faces in this way and believe that they are threatened by NATO. But he is predictably unpredictable in his behavior. And I couldn't quite figure out why that was until a friend of mine, Dmitry Trenin, I think you were present when he said this, who's a Russian researcher and analyst in very well regarded, explained that this unpredictability had to be understood in the context of a country which considered itself to be militarily inferior, both to the whole of Europe and certainly to NATO, including the United States of America. And its unpredictability in terms of its tactical behavior, was a way of keeping that opponent off guard, and therefore disturbing their certainty that they could properly deter him and control what he was doing. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that it's right, but at least it makes a lot of sense. Now, I just, my final remark on this, having described these two great forces coming together with possessing 93% of the nuclear weapons in the world, is that it's not easy for me to be confident that they are both equipped to make the best of that mixture. So I think that there is one possibility, which is that the European allies will find a way of distinguishing themselves from the United States, but staying in the grand alliance that is NATO, and perhaps find a way to be the bridge between these two, so that we can all live with some peace and security in this very dangerous environment that I come from.
Thanks, Des. Gareth, given your own words about Trump, and given what Des has just said about Putin, from the point of view of global nuclear risks, who is the more dangerous of the two?
They're both equally dangerous because they're both pushing things to the limits. When you're modernising your armoury, when you're not stepping backwards on any arms control measures, when you're maintaining massive deployments which are more or less equal on both sides, when you're keeping this high alert status on both sides, when you are instinctively sort of authoritarian on both sides, I think there's a lot more competence on Putin's side than the other. But irrespective of any move by either to deliberately use nuclear weapons, I just think all the elements are there for this sort of miscalculation dimension, the human error, the system error, careering out of control in some context. And it's a combination of both of them. What we have to do is step back. We have to step back. We're not going to get to universal disarmament anytime soon, and it's quixotic to think so. And, we can argue about the utility of a nuclear weapons ban treaty to achieve that. What we've got to do is get a freeze and then a reduction in the number of weapons. We've got to get a reduction on both sides of the number of deployments. We've got to get all these weapons taken off high alert. We have to get agreed changes in doctrine with all sides accepting no first use, with the reduction in deployments and alert status giving some confidence that that's to be believed, a doctrinal move of that kind. Steps of that kind are crucially necessary. And they've got to come from both of them, not one or the other. The only hope I have at all for the next 4 years at least that there's any forward move possible is in Des's very last comment when he talked about the European NATO allies possibly having a bit of a rethink about their so far willingness to go along with a pretty unthinking enthusiasm for all matters nuclear and nuclear deterrent. Equally, my hope is that particularly with the change of government in Korea, there'll be some new thinking in Korea, in Japan, and in Australia as the Asian allies of the United States about our hitherto, in recent years, unthinking support for the nuclear weapon in every conceivable deterrent dimension. We didn't give Obama any help at all when he wanted to move that very first step towards no first use. Japan, under its socialist government, toyed with the idea for as long as that government was around. Korea toyed with the idea, but immediately succumbed to the big Monty Python boot coming at it from the Washington and internal divisions. Australia, under its conservative administration, didn't even toy with the idea. We just said, that's terrible. We want to go We just want to keep the nuclear deterrent in all its form. But if these countries together get more sensible about the risks and dangers that are associated with the present nuclear environment and start putting pressure for a step back from that, then we've got at least the beginnings of an environment in which some resumption of sanity can assume. But there's a lot of other dimensions of this. Ballistic missile defense and so on are all creating further diversions and difficulties on other fronts. The build-up of conventional capability and other anxieties. But, that's the only thing that gives me any hope, the possibility of the allies, the United States allies, rethinking their position.
Thanks. Seung-Hwan, I'm going to depart from the question I gave you in advance, because I want to run with this theme, which is critically important. It seems to me one of the more important statements in the decade might turn out to be the already much quoted sentence from Angela Merkel, that in this Trump world now, the United States, reliance on the United States is somewhat questionable. Given what Gareth just said, given what we've just heard, can Trump, and given the fact that you have a new president and administration in South Korea, can Trump be the catalyst to open up thinking and debate amongst the Pacific and Asian allies that should have been there anyway but hasn't taken place, but now is the opportunity to take back, to reclaim agency for reordering the security arrangements and thinking in Asia Pacific?
Well, during the Obama days, as you know, he has pivoted to Asia. But what Trump is doing is he is abrogating everything Obama did. So when he was elected, same in Australia and in Korea, what we were concerned was he will pull his hand from this area. So I'm not sure whether President Trump continue to involve in the affairs in this area. But one good thing we hear is that North Korean nuclear threat is one of the top priority agenda. And he said he will not sit idle under the threat of North Korean nuclear threat. So we hope that everybody's talking about speaking ill of him, but anyhow, I really hope that he can give some impetus of moving forward in this area in nuclear issue and also security issue as well.
So, the paradox of all of this, of course, is that one of the few elements of President Trump's campaigning which he brought forward into his presidency in a consistent way was his professed desire to improve US-Russia relations. So you will all remember that from the early stage of his campaigning to be the president, he was saying that he admired President Putin, he admired the strength with which he governed his country, he felt that he was his kind of person, and he thought he could do a deal with him. And I think this is more or less a direct quote. Wouldn't it be great if we got on better with Russia? So that's a paradox, in relation to the way in which he behaves, I think. He's a man who's full of paradoxes, but in the way in which he behaves in the multilateral environment and in the international environment, it's inconsistent in a sense with America first, but not if he thinks that it is in America's interest to get on with Russia and never mind what anybody else thinks, which is, of course, why the Europeans got worried about NATO. Of course, the second thing that he brought forward, which was consistent, was that the Europeans should pay their way more for their security. I happen to agree with that, and I think that is the right message, and it's a message that's been given to Europeans by American presidents and defense ministers in particular for a number of years. But then there's another element in this that you have to take into account that we haven't yet considered, which is Congress. So even although the Republicans control Congress and they appear to be able to absorb a significant amount of embarrassment by this president and problems and still support him, the one thing that they are focused on is they are focused on these investigations about Russia's interventions in the 2016 US election, now compounded by the way in which the head of the FBI was dismissed, which has become a significant element of this investigation. So we're about to see next week Mr. Comey give evidence, we understand, and it's being trailed that he intends to say things which will be very difficult for the president. So Congress is a very important element of American foreign policy. A very small number, of very important senators control the major thinking of this enormous body. And I would say that in my time there, this just became a toxic environment about attitudes to Russia. It is toxic. That's the word that I've written down here. The atmosphere in Washington is increasingly toxic, and the future of relations between Washington and Moscow, as permitted by Congress, is increasingly uncertain. The language that is being used to describe what Russia is doesn't give you a sense that there is a push from people for it to be improved. In fact, they want a hardened view. They want increased sanctions. They want these relationships to be much harder relationships rather than softer and engaged relationships. But then, and here's the final problem, and you tell me what all of this means, is that beyond the public rhetoric, it is almost impossible to find any serious politician in the United States of America of either party who doesn't think that we should be maintaining a level of dialogue with Russians. So privately, and I do a lot of this dialogue with Russians, privately when you speak to these politicians, some of whom are serious figures whose rhetoric is very hardline, they say, but yes, we should talk to them. We should maintain a dialogue with them, but we should only maintain a dialogue with them against a background of very strong deterrence and on our issues. And then we have this phrase that we use, that nobody in the NATO alliance can do business as usual with the Russians. In my whole political life, we've never done business as usual with the Russians. It's always been an unusual business we did with the Russians. We never did business as usual. So, make of that what you like. But, these people, many of them are cold warriors, war warriors, and they knew how important it was to maintain dialogue with the other side. And, the ultimate irony of the whole thing is that we talk to each other more at the height of the Cold War than we presently do, in these circumstances 25 years after we thought we'd finished it.
Well, yeah, if I may add some word regarding Asian situation. This morning I read in the Wall Street Journal a quite encouraging words there. His national security advisor said, America first doesn't mean America alone. So we really hope that, President Trump is keep changing his words. If we say in good words, he's evolving. So I hope he will look into the reality and he will understand what's happening here. And we should be finger crossed on what he will be doing there.
Yeah, just stay with the mic, Seung-Hwan, because I want you to take up the next question and then the others can answer if they like, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And the next question is there scope for Presidents Trump and Putin to cooperate in resolving the North Korean nuclear challenge? Because that is something on which all three of China, Russia, and America share an interest in trying to stop weaponization. And what are the risks of that effort being derailed by this state of toxic relations between Moscow and Washington bilaterally, but also with the failure of US compliance with the letter and spirit of the Iran deal? So where do you see these two coming in? Because I think we focus a lot on China, but we forget Russia is an important player in resolving this also.
President Putin said U.S.-Russia relation is pretty low. But in spite of that, North Korean nuclear issue has been one of the areas where they maintained close cooperation. Even though there are some differences, both countries are asking North Koreans not to do any more tests. But regarding the timing of resumption of the dialogue, they have some difference. Russia is more on early dialogue without any conditions, but U.S., they put some conditions. If you commit not to test, then we'll come to dialogue. So there is some difference, but anyhow, they have maintained a good relationship, particularly on this issue. But one thing I'm worried is that since President Trump asked President Xi Jinping to do more roles and put more pressure on North Korea in resolving this North Korean nuclear issue, now North Korea can use Russia by strengthening their relations as a way out. So instead of importing oils and foods from China, he can bring more oil and food from Russia. And already we see some signs there. So it is a bit worrisome, but anyhow, Putin and Trump will maintain their relations on North Korean nuclear issue. And compared with the Iran deal, I think I really want to be like Garrett, incorrigible optimist, but I'm not that optimistic about we can make a deal with North Korea like Iran. Iran's case, I mean, Iran is more exposed to the international community, but North Korea is a closed society, and I mean, this economic incentives doesn't work so much. The North Korean nuclear is directly related with the survival, regime survival itself. So it will be hard to have that kind of deal. But anyhow, Iran still can be a model for us because, as former Secretary Kelly said, we didn't have a shot or we didn't send our soldiers, but we resolved this nuclear threat. Yes.
Either of you want to add?
The one thing that gives me heart about continued reasonable cooperation between Trump and Putin on North Korea is that there was indeed pretty good cooperation on the resolution of the Iran issue, at least once the United States got its act together and recognized that some compromises would have to be made, including a recognition of some continuing status as a uranium possessor, an enriched uranium possessor by Iran. When there's no immediate skin in the game, when there's no immediate national interest competing, then cooperation on this kind of issue is, I guess, perfectly possible. It is going to require some new thinking on the American side to move forward on this, in particular recognizing the reality, as I think South Korea eventually has to recognize, that the denuclearization is not an immediate option. There's going to have to be a freeze strategy and so on. But let's go there again. The one point I would want to just make in passing as a salutary reminder for those who think that Donald Trump is at least a deal maker and ought to be able to cut a deal in all sorts of contexts without the baggage which has inhibited perhaps some creative new thinking on some of these issues. I just remember in this context the widely held view about Bibi Netanyahu when he became Prime Minister of Israel, namely that this guy believed in so little he could actually make a deal with anybody, and that therefore there was a very real prospect of some forward movement on the Israel-Palestine peace process. In fact, he has been able to make a deal with absolutely nobody except the forces of the extreme right, which he's used to prop himself up domestically. And any hope that that value-free approach to conflict resolution might produce results has well and truly ebbed away. And I suspect that any confidence that Donald Trump, the deal maker, can operate in a this sort of environment and produce results is equally likely to prove utterly misconceived.
I'm so glad you're an incorrigible optimist, Gareth. Des.
So to directly answer the three questions you asked, clearly Donald Trump believes there is a connection between Russia and the challenge of the DPRK, or the challenge of North Korea. Why do I say that? Well, the tweet that he put out, which was interpreted, I think, rightly as passing responsibility to China, gets a lot of attention. But on the occasion of the last test, the White House issued a statement which looks to me from its words as though it was dictated by Donald Trump. And it specifically said in it that the most recent test was closer to Russia than to Japan. So he, in the official statement, clearly in his mind, wanted to engage the Russians in thinking about the consequences of this test for them. Now, the second, so I think from his point of view, I'll come to Putin just in a second, because the answer, I think, candidly to the second part of your question is, I don't think you can disconnect anything that matters between, the United States and Russia from the uncertainty of U.S.-Russia relations. So the answer to your question is, I honestly do not think we're capable of, America might be, it might go around the world telling people that they have to take nuclear issues into a separate file and we can't discuss other things, but I think it's going to be impossible for them to be able to do that with any element of the relationship with Russia. We have history of the Americans being able to do that recently on other things, but not on Donald Trump's watch. And I think that's where that stands. And I have no idea what President Putin thinks about North Korea in relation to his relationship with Putin and therefore Russia's relationship with the United States of America. I suspect that he sees it as an element that he can use as leverage for other interests, and he will complicate that. And in my consistent experience of 10 years of maintaining dialogue with Russians at a very high level is that if you want to talk to them about anything, you have to talk to them about everything. So, I'm interested in talking to them about nuclear weapons, and they say, talk to us about everything. We want to talk about military from space to cyberspace, and we'll talk about it in that context, because otherwise, now they don't always do that when you actually talk to them about it, but that's what they say. So they like these linkages because they've got leverage. Now let me come to the Iran deal. The Iran deal is really interesting from the point of view of how a Trump administration will act, as opposed to how it will act in rhetoric. So at the Carnegie conference, before the Trump administration started to act on some of these things, the expectation by 80% of the people at the Carnegie conference was that the Trump administration would derogate, would renege on the Iran deal. There was no question. All the experts said, this is doomed. Republicans hate it. Trump said all of this sort of stuff. But they haven't. And actually, although they're very hard line about it, and they say that they will make sure the letter of it is observed, they have said that they will respect it. So they're not going to renege on the Iran deal. And the reason they're not going to do that is because there is no upside for the United States on reneging on the Iran deal, because nobody would ever believe them again, including their allies, in a discussion. This negotiation does not belong to them. This deal does not belong to them. It belongs to the world. Very important countries came together. China made an enormous contribution. Russia made an enormous contribution. Europe made an enormous contribution, and then the United Nations, for the rest of the world, endorsed this deal. So this would put America in a very difficult position about having its word taken in the future if it walked away from it, and it would put it in an enormously difficult situation of bringing forward its allies, including the United Kingdom, who are the strongest ally and our closest ally, in future deals of this nature. And they don't want to be in that position. But while it is not a deal, and I accept that you can use as a template for North Korea, it would send an incredibly negative message into any potential progress with North Korea on a negotiated basis. If the United States of America said, we just made a deal in not identical but very similar circumstances over the same weapon systems, but we've reneged on it before the ink was dry on it. So it would make it intensely difficult for them to make progress.
Thanks, Des. Of course, I was on that panel at Carnegie that you were referring to. I was on that panel at Carnegie that I was referring to, that you were referring to. Yeah. I've got other questions, but I'm going to put them aside. It's time to go to the Q&A. If you could identify yourself and address a question either to someone in particular or general. Let's start with the two here.
Paul Meyer, Simon Fraser University. An observation and a question. I mean, the observation, I just endorsed the words matter and the high water mark of Obama's leadership in getting a world without nuclear weapons enshrined as a goal, not only for the U.S., but for the NATO alliance, was of crucial importance. At the same time, it is evident that efforts are underway to retract that. And all you need to do is compare the G7 statements on arms control and disarmament between their foreign ministers meeting last year and the one in this April, and American fingerprints all over that, to the effect that it's no longer an unqualified commitment there, but a sort of six-line, contorted, unspecified conditions that might ultimately could allow for a world without nuclear weapons. So it's already underway, and I hope Gareth and Des Brown are right in saying that it may galvanize European NATO allies to start mounting a defense of these issues. But it's crucial, and it's underway right now. A question to Des Brown, and I hope not too provocative, but there was a period where in those who were promoting nuclear disarmament looked to the UK as being the most likely nuclear weapon state to actually divest itself of that. Maybe not necessarily out of altruistic commitments to disarmament, but simply out of the reality of maintaining some effective conventional military capacity. And I just wonder, in the light of Brexit and in the light of the request for another referendum by Scotland, and given the strategic location of the deterrent forces, the renewed trident that the UK has endorsed, if you could comment on the possibility of eventually the implications of this for retaining nuclear weapons in the UK. Thank you.
So yeah, so you can't go around the world with this accent on these issues and not be asked this question. So but before I do, I think your point about the survivability of the phrase "a world without nuclear weapons" or striving for a world without nuclear weapons is an important one, because at that very conference that we have been referring to, the Carnegie Conference on Nuclear Issues in Washington, I was looking for his name, maybe Chris Boyd, yeah, Chris Ford explicitly told the conference that the Trump administration was reviewing that position. My parting shot to my friends who are progressive in their thinking about these issues in the United States was to hope that the administration stays in review and doesn't actually make a decision, because it's the point at which this administration may make decisions that things will be worrying. But you're right, be concerned about that. And, I mean, as Gareth has already reminded us, we all have a collective responsibility for not, pushing behind Barack Obama after the Prague speech about a number of issues. Europeans on tactical nuclear weapons were a disgrace in terms of trying to support what that administration was seeking to do. So we all cheered him to the echo, and then we all went home and left him standing, in the centre of Prague on his own and said, just get on with it. It'll be fine. When you've done it, let us know. So Scotland, well, I mean, let me just say at the outset, I mean, I'm not in favour of Scottish independence, and I never have been, right? So, I mean, I'm in favour of retaining the Union. I am a consistent unionist. I'm also in favour of the European Union. So, I didn't vote for Brexit either, but that's where we are politically. So, I honestly think that the prospect of Scottish independence is receding and not growing larger, and that's not just because that's the result that I want to see, but I mean, Scotland's economic relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom is one of dependence, and it's increasingly dependence because of the price of North Sea oil, because no money can be made from North Sea oil any longer, and therefore there can be no tax revenue from it, and frankly, Scotland sits in the United Kingdom in a situation of relative deficit in that it spends 19% more than it takes in taxation. So, the Scottish people are not stupid. They may be in significant numbers very nationalistic and quite emotional about being Scottish, but they're pretty hard-headed, and they're very sophisticated in terms of the way in which they vote. And the polling suggests to me that people are thinking, why would you vote to create Greece inside the United Kingdom? Why would you vote to create a situation that you knew was a disaster for Greece, where you had separate monetary policy from fiscal policy, and you were running a deficit, and other people were controlling your country? We may as well stay where we are and let London continue to subsidise us. So, I mean, I think that's what's likely to happen. So I don't think so it doesn't alter the fact that it's an interesting question, right? Yeah. Well, so no, I'm not ducking and weaving on this. I mean, so Scotland's policy was, in independence, get your nuclear weapons out of this country. I remind you, the Ukraine's position when it disaggregated from the Soviet Union was, get your Russian, your Russian Navy out of Sevastopol. They didn't get it out of Sevastopol, and that's part of the reason why they lost Crimea. But decades later, you can stay. I'm not suggesting that Scotland would have got to that point, but you have to be really careful about moving nuclear weapons. And it's not in Scotland's interest to move them to somewhere where they're not safe. And building the infrastructure for where they would be safe otherwise in the United Kingdom would take a decade or more. So this is not an imminent development, even if they went. And the likelihood would be that if they went, they would have to go someplace that was safe. And I personally think it would have to be an underused US East Coast naval yard that was equipped to look after them, because they're not going to go down to the south of England. So this is not going to lead to disarmament anyway, even if they are moved. But I don't think they would be moved.
What about moving them to a destruction facility?
Well, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I mean, we've committed to our strategic deterrence being based on these weapon systems. Parliament has voted for it. That's the policy. There isn't a party now that's likely to be in government that says that it has another policy. But, you never know. Post-Brexit, we might not be able to afford to do it. That's the most likely.
Let's get another question.
Right, so I'm Yves Thibogin from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and I heard some good news, and it was by having nothing said so far about India and Pakistan. And there were some years back where the biggest worry to the nuclear weapon was Pakistan becoming a nuclear state, and the issue of control, command and control in Pakistan, the issue of air trigger between Pakistan and India. So could anyone give an update of the situation there? Has it stabilized? How is the command and control situation? Is there any risk? Why is it not mentioned as a top concern? Is it good news, or just that it was crowded out?
I'll duck and weave and hand that over to Gareth.
Well, no, it's still a matter of immense concern, and I mentioned it tangentially in passing by saying that the risk of accidental and idiocy use is compounded when you've got more players in the game, particularly when they've got less sophisticated command and control systems than the other traditional players. No, the reality is that both India and Pakistan are increasing their arsenals, moving up into the 120 plus sort of range. Pakistan is talking about acquiring tactical nuclear weapons, which is very destabilizing and concerning. Both sides are talking about putting weapons on boats and to submarines, which from one point of view, if everything else is got rid of, that can be guaranteed retaliatory capability and can be stabilizing, but I don't think you can say that in a South Asian context at the moment. The tensions are still enormously high, as between Pakistan and India, as demonstrated just in the last few days. There's been new uproar in Kashmir. The civilian military control relationship issues in Pakistan are as far from being resolved as ever, with the military still calling all the shots, and the military still with a long record of engagement with darker Islamist forces. Take one more incident like Mumbai, and really the situation could career very, very rapidly out of control again. It's a very worrying, very disconcerting situation, and it's certainly one of the reasons why I, for one, am as pessimistic as I am about the current state of play. It's certainly not off the agenda at all.
Let me just give 3 propositions to add to and reinforce. One, the state of relations between India and Pakistan at the moment is the worst it has been in 14 to 15 years. It's completely frozen. They're not doing anything together. 2, both countries are enlarging their nuclear stockpiles. 3, they're expanding their delivery platforms and going through the triad. So it's not a cheering story either. Any other questions?
Can I just add one quick anecdote to reinforce what I said? In the time of the Mumbai terrorist attack and a very, very fragile situation between the two, I happened to be in Rawalpindi, in Pakistan, and I was attending a roundtable meeting. I was running International Crisis Group at the time with high-level defence and foreign policy officials, and I said, how can any of us be confident that this situation won't explode and escalate out of control with ricocheting response and counter-response and so on? And I was told, well, don't trouble your head about that, because we do have these hotlines between ourselves, militarily and politically, between Indian and Pakistani leaders, and you can assume that we're very, very conscious of the risks involved in this situation careering out of control. On the way to the car park, 5 minutes later, I was tugged in my sleeve by a very, very junior officer who had been sitting at the back of the room, and he said, not really appropriate for me to say this, but I would not want you to go away without understanding that in terms of those hotlines, neither of them have been used since the commencement of this particular terrorist attack and all the uncertainty and anxiety that's flown from it. Neither of them have been used. So the truth of the matter is there's a hell of a distance between the rhetoric and the reality is quite alarming.
Let's take 2 more questions, one from a gentleman here and then from Marianne there, and then we'll come back to the panel and see if we have any time left after that. Yes, please.
네, 한반도 사드 배치되어 있습니다. 지금 국제사회가 북한 방문해서 언제쯤 북핵 제거를 할 수 있는지 그것이 궁금합니다. 네, 감사합니다.
I think someone might have to
네, 한반도 사드 배치가 지금 되어 있습니다. 그래서 제가 국제사회가 언제쯤 북한 방문해서 북핵 제거를 할 수 있는지 그것이 궁금합니다. 예.
You start answering that by telling us what the question is.
Now the SAD system is being deployed in Korea now, and he's asking when international community can resolve this North Korean nuclear issue. So, I mean, well, this North Korean nuclear issue will be the top agenda between the summit between President Trump and President Moon next month. And I mean, so far the U.S. policy is maximum pressure and engagement. And the Korean government's policy is not that clear yet. But they should coordinate how to deal with North Korean nuclear issue during the summit. And this North Korean nuclear issue has been dealt. North Korea's long-standing desire is to talk directly with the United States, not in the international community. So the question is whether we should resume six-party talks or we should resolve these issues through dialogue between North Korea and U.S. or should South Korea join that dialogue? So, I mean, that should be decided by two presidents next month, I think. Yeah.
And we'll take one final question from Marianne.
Yes, Marianne Hansen, University of Queensland. Des, I wonder if I can just ask you a little bit about the irresponsible rhetoric comment, because this is something that I think is very, very troubling on a number of levels. Is it because these leaders are poorly informed? You know, they're giving very unnuanced black and white statements. I mean, we can sort of expect it from Trump, but from Theresa May, Tony Blair, even, you know, the very categorical statements that, yep, we have a right to these weapons, we're going to be using them. How do you account for that? Because, as you say, it is very different from practices during the Cold War. And can anything be done about it?
Yeah, so I think, you know, words are, someone earlier said words are important, and they are extremely important in this environment. And the word to use a nuclear, you know, the verb to use a nuclear weapon in English is used in two different ways. Most people I talk to, when they talk about using nuclear weapons, mean using them in a kinetic way, you know, exploding the damn things. But actually, in the parlance of those who support these as a continuing strategic deterrent, they say that they use them every day because they're deterring their use against them. Now, as with much of the sort of mystique that goes with these weapons, it doesn't often bear close examination because, you know, we presently in the United Kingdom have a national assessment of the threats that we face, which says there is no strategic threat to the existence of the United Kingdom or to our country. So we do not believe that anybody owns these weapons and has the intent to use them against us. And we hold these weapons because at some point in the future, you know, that may change, and that uncertainty in the world, we say, justifies us. It's the poorest argument possible for these weapons, but that uncertainty and the possibility that future generations may face justifies us maintaining these weapons for that to deal with that potential change. But then we say we deploy them every day and we use them to deter when we're saying we're not deterring anything. So you get confused. And I think we need to be very careful with the way in which we use words. And the point is that we had, during the Cold War, we developed a way of referring to these weapons that gave you the sense that leaders knew the awesome destructive power that these weapons had. You know, and they would say the minimum about them. Right. So when people were asked, they never answered the question, would you use them or not? And President Reagan developed this phrase, and then he persuaded Gorbachev to develop it, and everybody got it. And people would just say, you know, a nuclear war is a war that must never be fought because it can never be won. And that was fine. And you got a sense that people knew and understood that. Then you know, we've not had the Cold War for 25 years, you know, and we've had a generation of people, you know, including my two children, who have grown up without having to worry about these because they thought that the job was done and that we would eventually rid the world of these weapons. And then you get President Obama to say, I will lead the charge over the last stage of this process, and everybody thinks we're moving into that. So you can hardly criticize people for not being steeped in, the discipline of nuclear weapons when they come to power. But what you can't, I don't think, excuse is people using irresponsible language. So, for example, the Russian ambassador to Denmark says in a speech in Denmark that if the Danish take part of a ballistic missile defense structure in the form of radar, then they will put themselves in the front line for targets should war break out. Now, actually, you can understand why he would say that. But within 5 minutes, it's in social media saying the Russian ambassador threatened Denmark with nuclear weapons. Now, that is not actually what he did, but it doesn't really matter. He was irresponsible. President Putin actually, in my view, never thought about using nuclear weapons in Crimea. But a year or more afterwards, he was musing in front of a journalist and he said, I thought about doing it. And I don't believe for a minute he thought about doing it, but he shouldn't have said it. And of course, the people who love these weapons and think that they do all keep us safe, but only some of us should have them, actually trade on this. So, we get NATO ministers coming out of meetings and saying publicly, without having discussed it in the meetings, that it's maybe time that NATO started to practice the escalation of conventional war to nuclear war. Now, it hasn't done it for 25 years. Why would it start to do it again? It will take us 25 years not to do it. And it's a function of the need for people to have an enemy to reinforce their prejudices, but it's also a function of the fact that people have lost the discipline of the awesome nature of these weapons and the responsibility that it brings. You see the worst examples of this, in this peninsula, where the leader of North Korea, talks in a highly irresponsible way about these weapons to such an extent that people actually believe he's going to do what he says he will do. And why would they not? And that's what leads to, I think, the set of circumstances that, we've all mentioned here, which is when you've got these weapons and then you have other problems between you and you start to behave in a way that is not respectful of the need to keep a dialogue across the divides that we have and to damp things down rather than escalate them up, that somebody might just make a mistake. If a Russian pilot barrel rolls into an American ship somewhere in the Mediterranean, God help the rest of us.
Thanks, Des. I have the responsibility for maintaining the time discipline, and we are 2 minutes beyond the scheduled close. Let me go back to something that Gareth started off with, which was the doomsday clock being at 2.5 minutes to midnight. At the Jeju Forum last year, it was at 3 minutes to midnight. It was moved there in a rare 2-minute move from 5 minutes to midnight, and we thought that was bad. Now we meet at 2.5 minutes. It'll be interesting in a year's time when the Jeju Forum convenes again to think back and see if at that time it has moved to 2 minutes to midnight or if it has moved back to 3 minutes to midnight. Nothing you have heard would incline you to the optimistic assessment, but we can but live in hope. Will you please join me in thanking our three panelists?